Hi everyone. So I wanted to do this little video that summarizes some of the main themes and points that were brought out of the active listening reflections, because as I was going through your submissions, you all made some really fantastic points, and there were common threads that you could pull out between different reflections. So I wanted to do a video that summarized some of the primary points that I was hearing and some of the common themes that you could pull out from your different insights. Now, to kind of preface this video, I wanted to keep it fairly short and concise, so there's no way that I could include every thoughtful aspect of everyone's reflection. So if you don't see different thoughts and connections that you made in your own reflection in this PowerPoint, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean that yours was any more or less valuable. I just wanted to pick out some of the common threads that I was hearing. So the first one, and this one was pretty common, is that active listening is harder than expected. Now, when you look at these three micro skills on paper, inquiry, paraphrase, acknowledge, it seems simple. There's only three things that you can do. You look at the exercise, the other person's going to be talking for 3 minutes. How hard can it be to occasionally list off what they said and check for understanding, ask an open-ended question, and acknowledge some emotions? Actually, it's really challenging, and I think that goes to show that these are skills that we don't often use as much as we should, and when we do use them, we're often not thinking about them in this way. So even when we think we're active listening, sometimes we aren't. This was something that I heard in a couple of different reflections, is that folks came into the exercise thinking that they had a really strong background in active listening, but then realizing when they got in the moment that they may not actually be listening as actively as they should. They're either doing more passive listening, where they're kind of sitting there and taking in what's being said by the other side, but not checking for understanding, not digging deeper to make sure that they're getting all of the nuances, and not showing the other side that they're being heard. Additionally, another side of this is that some folks came in thinking that they developed some pretty strong active listening skills, and then realized that the skills that they were using were actually a form of assertion in some way. They were asking those loaded questions, that hot inquiry that actually is more of either an interrogation or embedding the answer that you want to hear in the question, or paraphrasing things that insert their own ideas into it, or acknowledging in a way that minimizes the emotions to try to reconfigure what the other person is feeling in a way that's more comfortable for them, or even saying things that were just blanket assertions, which just kind of gets to the next point, that there's a tendency when someone is, especially we heard this in the frustrating experience, the first iteration of the active listening exercise, that there is often a tendency to want to show understanding by sharing a similar story or experience of our own. Now, we engaged with this on the discussion board, and we engaged with this through the materials in the following weeks after the active listening exercise, the pros and cons of this. But in the moment, something to remember is that when we share a story or experience of our own, in addition to some questionable ways that may land on the other side, it's that we're not listening. We've now taken over the narrative and are inserting our own into this story. Or into the conversation by sharing our own story or experience. We're not inviting them to speak more, we're instead asserting back an experience of our own. There's often a tendency to want to problem solve in order to help. Now this came up pretty strongly in a couple of reflections, and especially again in that first iteration where we're hearing about the frustrating experience of something else. And the exercise in some ways designed to bring that out. When someone's bringing a frustration to us, they're essentially bringing a problem. And a lot of times our immediate tendency is to want to go into problem solving mode because we want to help. And something to kind of to push on a little bit is, in addition to problem solving being something that can help someone, also just being someone there to listen and to help them process their own thoughts and to make them feel heard can also help someone. I think in times that we've been the speaker, we've all been in situations in which we are really just ranting to someone and processing out loud, and suddenly they turn into problem solving just after we've said a couple of sentences, and one, they don't understand our problem enough to help us yet, and two, that's really not what we needed from them in the moment. So this exercise was kind of pushing us into a box as the listener to say, I'm just going to listen, I'm just going to try to understand them. Now there may be a point in the conversation a few minutes later after this active listening exercise that cut, that we would start engaging in problem solving with the other side. But the kind of 2 points around that is, if we're going to flip into problem solving, we want to make sure that it's wanted by the other side and that we thoroughly understand where they're coming from. And then secondly, to remember that even if our role is just listening, and we're not problem solving in that moment, listening in and of itself can be something that helps. Now, I just wanted to point out some differences here in reflections. Some people said that the easiest micro skill was inquiry. Some said that it was paraphrasing. Some said that it was acknowledgement. And on the flip side, some said that the hardest micro skill was inquiry. Some said that it was paraphrasing, and some said that it was acknowledgement. Now, not everyone discussed the hardest and easiest micro skills, and that wasn't something that you had to do, and it wasn't part of the prompt. But it was something that seemed at the top of several of your minds, so I just wanted to dig into that a little bit. For different people, based on their comfort level, based on what they're already integrating into their conversation more, based on their background, these skills, these micro skills can be harder or easier. Additionally, sometimes they're harder and easier depending on the context. Some of you may have found that it was easier to inquire about a frustrating experience, but once you got into kind of the hot topic, the topic that you cared about a lot, and someone was speaking from the other side, you weren't really ready to ask questions, and you instead were just kind of paraphrasing what they said back. Just something to keep in mind is that you do want to try to find a balance of these skills in your conversations. One thing that did kind of come across was that acknowledgement was by and large more challenging for folks, and that one was mentioned more often. And acknowledging the emotions of the other side in a conversation in a way that is natural and feels natural to us can be really, really hard. And I think that may be an insight into how much we shy away from emotions in conversations, both our own and both those of the other side. You also differed in opinion on what type of topic was easier and which one was more challenging. Some found the frustrating experience harder to listen to because we wanted to flip into problem solving or for other reasons. And others found it more hard to listen to someone speaking about a topic that you cared passionately about, but from the opposite perspective. And I found it interesting that you all were pretty split down the middle over which type of topic was easier or harder to listen to. As speakers, some of you mentioned that when you were in the speaker role, it was really great to be listened to, which is something unique about this exercise too. Is our focus is on the listener and the listener skills, but we gain a lot of insights as speakers as well. Something that was interesting that we brought up at a couple of reflections was that as listeners, sometimes the micro skills felt forced in some way, felt contrived because you were really thinking about them and really saying like, oh, I need to acknowledge emotion in this moment, and then it came out. But as speakers, it sounded a lot more natural than what was necessarily going on in the head of the listener as they were using the skills. And a lot of speakers seem to just really appreciate being able to process out loud and being able to speak in a space that they could be heard. Active listening can help the speaker better understand their own experience. This came up in a couple of reflections as well, was that an active listener either was able to help a speaker process and kind of get to the bottom or the core issue that was actually at play, or a speaker was reflecting from their own perspective, saying that they were kind of, all over the place, and the active listener helped them get into a direction where they could understand the different pieces and parts of the points that they were trying to make. But I think that kind of, this point connects back up to there's often a tendency to want to problem solve in order to help, whereas in other reflections, folks pointed out ways in which this active listener actually helped the speaker better understand their own experience and be better prepared to move forward in some way afterwards. As a listener, it's helpful to know your purpose and engaging. This was something that came up in a couple of different reflections. was that the listeners got lost a bit in the moment. You are able to do like 1 or 2 replies, and then after that, you're not really sure where to go next, which in some ways can also be an insight into the cadence of our natural conversations, or what we're most used to having is that we listen for like our listening capacity is like 45 seconds. They say something, we reply in something that's listening, they say something else, we give them a micro skill back, and then we're ready to say something that's assertive. And that's an interesting insight into how we're most used to communicating. Whereas it seemed to be helpful when people were in the roles of the active listener and they felt a little bit lost in the moment or didn't know how to continue, to actually have a purpose in that and to keep in mind, I'm trying to walk them down their ladder of inference, or I'm trying to understand their ladder of inference, or I want to make sure that I have explored all aspects of their story. What may I not know yet? If I've inquired a couple of times and I've been really getting into the what happened conversation of the 3 conversations, I also need to look at the identity conversation and see how this experience or their opinion on this topic connects with that. Or I need to figure out what the feelings conversation is and dig into that a little bit so I understand that. So that this point then gets into the next slide, which really connects active listening back with some of the other frameworks and concepts. Well, apparently I am going to have these pop up in a different order because the animation is hard. The first one here is the ladder of inference. Several of you made the connection between active listening and the ladder of inference, that when you are the active listener, you found yourselves being able to walk them down from their conclusion and get their perceptions, their observations, how they are interpreting this through their experiences, and also get to the data below. So that was a really helpful way to both think about your role as an active listener, was to be able to walk them down their ladder of inference and thus understand it yourself, but was also just a connection in general with one of the purposes of active listening. A lot of you made the connection between active listening and empathy and perspective taking in general, is that active listening, when it is genuine, often comes from a place of deep empathy and wanting to take and understand the perspective of the other side. People brought up the 3 conversations, the what happened conversation, the identity conversation, and the feelings conversation. This came up in a couple of different ways. One, as I was just talking about, was framing the role of the active listener is to be able to explore all 3 of those conversations with the speaker and make sure that you have gained an understanding of how the experience or the opinion that they hold is impacted or relates to all 3 of those conversations. Additionally, people noted that active listening can be easier or harder when you're talking about when you're conversing within each one of those conversations. So some people found it really easy to continue going on that what happened conversation, but as soon as it bridged into the feelings conversation, it became harder to active listen for some reason, or when they didn't quite know how to engage when someone was talking about an identity issue. So something to keep in mind. The 5 core concerns also came up in a couple of aspects. Some people found it more challenging to listen when one of their 5 core concerns were stepped on or infringed on by the other side. This especially seemed to come up in the second iteration, where people were sharing an opinion that the listener disagreed with. And when someone's doing that, oftentimes we're starting to feel triggered by what the other person is saying because our 5 core concerns are stepped on. They're saying something that we passionately disagree with, and that impacts, in some ways it could impact our role. It could impact our autonomy. And so we're really wanting to push back against them because we're feeling an influx of emotions on our side. But the 5 core concerns in that way can make it harder when those are at play to go through our active listening micro skills and continue engaging. Additionally, speakers, though, in some respects started to recognize instances in which their 5 core concerns were actually cared for by the active listener, because they felt more autonomous in the conversation, because they weren't being immediately, put on the defensive in any way. That they were able to move more freely. And they felt an affiliation with the active listener because of the relationship that they were having. So you can see the 5 core concerns threaded throughout the exercise. Opening lines came up. Opening lines, I believe it came up mostly in regards to, depending on what the opening line of the other side is, it makes it easier or harder for you to active listen. That's something to be aware of when you are in the role of the listener, but also something to be aware of when you are engaging in a difficult conversation or negotiation, that your opening line can either put someone in a place where they are ready and prepared to listen to you and make that easier for them, or it can make it a whole lot harder. And additionally, a lot of you touched on how the exercise itself connected back to the active listening framework that was introduced in our course materials. So some thoughts going forward, and we're starting to talk about this on the discussion boards now as I'm recording this, is, how does active listening connect to assertion? In the discussion board, we're talking more broadly about how empathy connects to assertion. But something for you all to reflect on is, how does active listening connect to assertion? When you are listening to the other side in order to make them feel heard and to understand their perspective and understand the nuances of their opinions and their thought process, how does that then connect to the moment when you become the speaker and when you are asserting to the other side? How can you be active listening with a purpose that also then helps you when you're ready to assert? Additionally, something to think about is, how can you implement active listening into your negotiation simulation? You have a negotiation simulation this week, and it can be quite common when someone is preparing to go into a simulated negotiation or a real one to really be thinking about what I want to say to the other side and what I want the other side to understand from my perspective. And those are good things that you should be thinking about. And also, something else to think about is, how am I going to be prepared to active listen? What am I listening for? What am I trying to learn from active listening? How is active listening going to help me assert? Things along those lines will hopefully be running through your head as you're preparing to engage in your negotiation simulation as well. So thank you all for your fantastic reflections on the active listening exercise, and I appreciate being able to go through them and see some of these really wonderful themes and thoughtful connections that were coming out of your active listening reflections. So hopefully you can learn from some of the common things that were coming out from each other. And again, some of you made some really unique connections and had some really interesting thoughts that I was not able to include in this very brief PowerPoint. But good job to all of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing how active listening plays out for you in the negotiation simulation